My wife held my insulin over the sink and said, "If I can't have diabetes, then neither can you." When I begged her to stop, she laughed and said, "You're sweating already. What's that, 400? How long till your organs shut down?" I didn't say a word. That was 10 days ago. This morning, she was crying in court while they read the charges out loud. You know how they say marriage is all about sharing everything? Your hopes, your dreams, your Netflix password that you definitely shouldn't give out, but somehow always do because love makes you stupid. Well, turns out in my case, everything apparently included my pancreas's ability to function like a normal human organ. Lucky me, right? My wife Clara wasn't diabetic. Hell, the woman could down a bag of Skittles and maintain perfect blood sugar levels like some kind of metabolic superhero. But boy, did she act like my pancreas owed her 3 months back rent and a formal apology. From the moment I said, "I do," and signed those papers that basically said, "Till death or diabetic coma do us part," she treated my type 1 diabetes less like a serious medical condition and more like the world's most inconvenient party trick. At first, I thought it was cute. You know, newlywed naivety and all that garbage they feed you in those marriage books that cost $40 and tell you nothing you couldn't figure out from watching a sitcom. Clara would giggle when my glucose meter beeped, like it was some adorable alarm clock instead of a device literally keeping me alive. She'd watch me inject insulin with this fascinated expression, like I was performing some kind of magic show instead of, oh, I don't know, preventing myself from going into a coma. "Babe," I'd joke, trying to keep things light because God knows marriage is hard enough without adding medical drama to the mix. "You're sweet enough to give me a sugar spike just by looking at you." Classic husband material, right? Cheesy, slightly romantic, definitely trying too hard. She'd roll her eyes at my terrible attempts at diabetes humor and, get this, hide my glucose meter. Like it was some kind of game. Haha, so freaking hilarious. Let's play hide and seek with the device that tells me whether I'm about to die or just feel like I want to. Except it wasn't really cute, was it? Not when you're sitting there at 2 in the morning, feeling like absolute garbage, and you can't find the one thing that'll tell you if you need to chug orange juice or inject more insulin. Not when your hands are shaking and you're trying to explain to your wife that this isn't a joke. This is literally life or death stuff. And she's looking at you like you're being dramatic. But Clara had this way of making everything about her, you know? Like my diabetes was somehow cramping her style. God forbid I had to check my blood sugar before we went out to dinner. God forbid I couldn't just spontaneously decide to eat whatever looked good on the menu without doing some quick math that would make my high school algebra teacher proud. She'd tap her foot impatiently while I calculated carbs, sighing like I was personally ruining her entire evening by trying not to, die. The hiding thing started small. She'd move my glucose meter from the nightstand to the bathroom counter. "Oh, I was just cleaning," she'd say when I asked. Then it migrated to the kitchen drawer. Then the living room coffee table. It was like a twisted scavenger hunt where the prize was not going into diabetic shock. Real romantic stuff, let me tell you. I should have seen the red flags. Hell, they were practically neon signs at that point. But you know how it is when you're married. You want to give your spouse the benefit of the doubt. You want to believe that the person you pledged your life to isn't actively trying to make that life shorter. You tell yourself that she's just adjusting, that she doesn't really understand the severity of the situation, that she'll come around once she realizes this isn't some inconvenient hobby I picked up for attention. The jokes got meaner. Instead of eye rolls, I got actual lectures about how I was obsessed with my blood sugar. Like, yeah, Clara, I'm obsessed with not dying. Sue me. She'd mimic the way I'd check my levels, doing this exaggerated routine where she'd pretend to prick her finger and gasp dramatically. "Oh no, I'm at 120. Call the ambulance." Real mature stuff from a grown woman who supposedly loved me. That's when the joke started escalating into something that made my blood run cold, and not because of low glucose levels. She'd hide my supplies for longer periods. "Let's see how long hubby lasts without his little gadgets," she'd say with this smile that didn't reach her eyes. At first, I thought she was just being passive-aggressive about something else. Maybe I forgot to take out the trash, or maybe I made some comment about her mother that rubbed her the wrong way. Standard marriage stuff that you work through like adults. But then it hit me like a ton of bricks, or maybe like a severe hypoglycemic episode. This wasn't about forgotten anniversaries or dirty dishes. This was about control. This was about Clara needing to be the center of attention, even if it meant putting my life at risk. And that's when I realized something that should have been obvious from day one. Love might be blind, but it's definitely not glucose aware. Marriage, they tell you, is about sickness and health. What they don't mention is what happens when your spouse decides to test exactly how much sickness you can handle before the health part becomes permanently off the table. So apparently, being married to someone with a chronic illness wasn't enough for Clara. Oh no, that would be too simple, too normal. Why settle for being the supportive spouse when you could be the star of your own medical drama? And let me tell you, my wife had ambitions that would make a Hollywood producer weep with envy. It started about 3 months into our marriage, right around the time most couples are still in that honeymoon phase where you pretend your partner's weird habits are quirky instead of grounds for therapy. Clara decided that me having diabetes was like having a really cool toy that she wasn't allowed to play with. And if there's one thing I learned about my wife, it's that she doesn't handle being left out very well. Picture this. I'm sitting at the breakfast table, doing my usual morning routine of checking my blood sugar levels because, I enjoy living. Clara's watching me like I'm performing some kind of fascinating ritual instead of literally trying not to die before my first cup of coffee. Then, out of nowhere, she goes, "I bet I have diabetes too. I mean, it runs in families, right?" Wrong on multiple counts, sweetheart. First off, type 1 diabetes isn't exactly something you catch like a cold from your spouse. Second, it doesn't run in her family. It runs in mine, which is how I won the genetic lottery of having an autoimmune system that decided my pancreas was public enemy number 1. But did I explain this to her? Oh, you bet I did. Did she listen? Well, that's where things get interesting. Instead of accepting the basic facts of medical science, Clara decided to become her own one-woman research team. She started borrowing my glucose meter, which is a polite way of saying she'd snatch it right out of my hands when I wasn't looking. Then she'd prick her finger, after watching me do it approximately 8,000 times, and wait for the little number to pop up on the screen. "Look," she'd announce dramatically, waving the meter around like she'd just discovered fire. "I'm probably hypoglycemic." And then she'd stagger around the kitchen like she was auditioning for a community theater production of Woman Dying of Low Blood Sugar. Spoiler alert, she wasn't hypoglycemic. Her levels were perfectly normal, which in the diabetes world means congratulations, your pancreas actually does its job like it's supposed to. But here's the thing about Clara. She never let little things like facts get in the way of a good performance. When the meter showed normal readings, she'd squint at it suspiciously and declare that the device must be broken. "These things aren't accurate anyway," she'd say, conveniently forgetting that this same inaccurate device was what kept her husband from going into diabetic shock on a regular basis. The whole charade would always end the same way, with Clara dramatically collapsing onto our couch like some Victorian lady who'd just received tragic news via telegraph. She'd throw the back of her hand against her forehead and announce that she needed emergency sugar to prevent herself from fainting. And what kind of emergency sugar did she need? My emergency sugar. The glucose tablets I kept stashed around the house for actual emergencies. The juice boxes I bought in bulk because they're literally designed to bring diabetics out of dangerous low blood sugar episodes. Let me paint you a picture of what dinner looked like in our house during this phase. There's me, carefully counting carbohydrates like I'm some kind of mathematical genius, calculating exactly how much insulin I need to inject so I don't spend the evening feeling like I got hit by a truck. I've got my little notebook out, adding up the carbs in my chicken breast, my vegetables, my small portion of rice that I've measured with the precision of a chemist. And then there's Clara, who's apparently decided that she too needs to monitor her blood sugar before eating. Except instead of the careful, methodical approach of someone who actually has diabetes, she's performing this whole song and dance routine. She'll test her blood sugar, which is always normal, then shake her head sadly and announce that she's feeling low and needs extra carbs to bring her levels up. So while I'm over here eating my carefully portioned meal like a responsible adult who doesn't want to end up in the emergency room, Clara's loading up her plate like she's preparing for hibernation. "Doctor's orders," she'd say with a straight face, as if some imaginary physician had prescribed her a diet of unlimited pasta and breadsticks. The juice box situation was particularly infuriating. I'd come home from work, feeling that telltale shakiness that means my blood sugar is dropping fast, and I'd rush to the fridge for one of my emergency juice boxes. Guess what? They'd be gone. All of them. Clara would be sitting in the living room, empty juice boxes scattered around her like some kind of diabetic crime scene, explaining that she'd had multiple low episodes throughout the day. Multiple low episodes. This woman who'd never had a blood sugar reading below 80 in her entire life was claiming to have hypoglycemic episodes that would make an actual diabetic person jealous. It was like watching someone fake a limp for attention, except instead of just looking foolish, she was literally taking my life-saving supplies. If the Academy Awards gave out prizes for medical cosplay, Clara would have swept every single category. Best Actress in a Fake Hypoglycemic Episode. Best Supporting Wife in a Medical Drama that only exists in her head. Lifetime Achievement Award for Most Dedicated Performance of a Disease she doesn't actually have. The worst part? She was good at it. I mean, really good. She'd researched all the symptoms, memorized all the right words to use, even practiced that slightly confused look that people get when their blood sugar drops. If I hadn't been living with actual diabetes for years, I might have believed her act. But I knew better. I knew what real hypoglycemia looked like, felt like, sounded like. And watching Clara perform her version of it was like watching someone do a really offensive impression of something that could literally kill me if I didn't take it seriously. The sympathy carbs were just the cherry on top of this whole ridiculous Sunday. You know what's worse than having diabetes on your birthday? Having a wife who decides your birthday is the perfect time to debut her latest performance in medical conditions I don't actually have, the musical. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me set the scene for you, because this story is so ridiculous it needs proper context. Picture this. It's my 32nd birthday, and I'm actually feeling pretty good about life. My blood sugar's been stable all week, I've got friends coming over, and my mom made my favorite chocolate cake, the one with enough sugar to put a normal person into a coma. But hey, that's what insulin's for, right? I've been looking forward to this party for weeks. Mostly because it meant I could eat cake without Clara making some snide comment about my special diet. The gang's all there. My buddy Mike from college who still thinks he's 25, my coworker Sarah who always brings the best wine, even my neighbor Mrs. Peterson who invited herself but brings excellent gossip, so nobody minds. We're having a great time, everyone's laughing, the music's good, and I'm thinking maybe this whole marriage thing isn't so bad after all. Maybe Clara's weird medical obsession was just a phase, like when she went through that CrossFit period and wouldn't shut up about burpees. Wrong again, genius. So there we are, everyone gathered around the dining room table, cake blazing with 32 candles like some kind of sugary inferno. My friends start that awkward birthday song that somehow sounds different every time people sing it, and I'm standing there grinning like an idiot because, hey, it's my birthday, and I'm surrounded by people who actually like me. Life's good, you know? That's when Clara decides to make her grand entrance. Now, I should mention that up until this point, she'd been acting relatively normal. Sure, she'd done her usual routine of testing her blood sugar before dinner and announcing that she was feeling a little shaky, but I figured she'd keep the performance to a minimum since we had company. I mean, even Clara had to have some sense of social boundaries, right? Nope, not even close. Just as everyone gets to the happy birthday to you finale, Clara starts swaying. At first, I think maybe she's just getting into the music, because my wife has never been accused of being a good dancer. But then the swaying gets more dramatic, and she's clutching the back of her chair like she's on a ship in rough seas. I don't feel so good, she announces, loud enough to cut through the singing. Everyone stops mid-song, which is actually kind of impressive timing if you think about it. 32 people holding their breath while my wife proceeds to give the performance of her lifetime. And then, I kid you not, she drops to the floor like a sack of potatoes. Not gracefully, mind you. We're talking full theatrical collapse, complete with this little moan that sounded like she'd been practicing in the mirror. She's lying there on our hardwood floor, one hand dramatically flung across her forehead, the other twitching slightly for effect. My friends go into panic mode immediately. Mike, bless his heart, drops to his knees and starts checking her pulse like he's some kind of paramedic instead of an accountant who can barely handle his own hangovers. Sarah's on her phone calling 911 before I can even process what's happening. Mrs. Peterson starts fanning Clara with a paper plate, because apparently that's what you do when someone has a seizure. And me? I'm standing there, birthday candles still flickering on my cake, watching my wife perform what can only be described as the world's most inconveniently timed medical emergency. The frosting on my cake is starting to melt from the heat of the candles, and all I can think is, I just want my damn slice before this whole thing turns into a puddle. But nobody's thinking about cake anymore. They're all crowded around Clara, who's really milking this whole thing for everything it's worth. She's doing this flutter-eyed thing, like she's fighting to stay conscious, and making these little whimpering noises that would be heartbreaking if they weren't complete bullshit. Someone get her some orange juice. Mike shouts, because apparently everyone's an expert on hypoglycemia now. She might be having a diabetic episode. And that's when I lose it. Not in a screaming, throwing things kind of way, but in that quiet, internal way where you realize your life has become a sitcom written by someone with a really twisted sense of humor. Because here's my wife, who doesn't have diabetes, faking a diabetic emergency at my birthday party, while my actual birthday cake turns into a wax-covered mess. The paramedics show up, because of course they do, and Clara puts on this whole confused, disoriented act. "Where am I?" she asks weakly, like she's just woken up from a coma instead of taking an impromptu nap on our dining room floor. What happened? They check her vitals, test her blood sugar, and, surprise, surprise, everything's perfectly normal. But Clara's got an explanation for that too. "I feel so much better now," she tells them, sitting up slowly like she's recovering from major surgery. "I think it was just a blood sugar crash. I've been having problems with hypoglycemia lately." The paramedics are professional enough not to roll their eyes, but I can see them exchanging those looks that say another hypochondriac with Google MD. They give Clara some standard advice about eating regular meals and seeing her doctor, then pack up their equipment and head out to deal with actual emergencies. Meanwhile, my birthday party has officially become Clara's one-woman Broadway show. I too have diabetes, but not really. Everyone's clustered around her, asking if she's okay, if she needs anything, if she wants them to call her doctor. She's loving every second of it, playing the brave patient who's just grateful to be alive. My cake, by the way, is completely ruined. 32 candles burned down to nothing, frosting melted into a sugary soup, and nobody even remembers that we were supposed to be celebrating my birthday. It's like I've become a supporting character in my own life story. Later that night, after everyone's gone home and Clara's miraculously recovered enough to help clean up, I finally worked up the courage to tell her how messed up the whole thing was. "That was really screwed up, Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Faking a medical emergency at my birthday party? In front of all our friends." She just shrugged, like she was discussing what to have for breakfast instead of admitting to staging a fake seizure. "At least people remember me now," she said with this little smile that made my blood run cold. "Yeah," I replied, as the woman who hijacked a grown man's birthday cake with performance art. "Congratulations on that achievement." Black Friday weekend. You know, that magical time of year when normal human beings transform into bargain-hunting zombies, trampling each other for discounted electronics and fighting over the last markdown toaster like it's the cure for cancer. Most people spend this weekend camping out at Target or refreshing Amazon pages until their fingers bleed. My wife, Clara, she decided to go shopping for something a little more personal, my ability to stay alive. I should have known something was up when I woke up that Friday morning and Clara was already dressed and moving around the house with the kind of purpose usually reserved for people who've had way too much coffee or are planning something seriously sketchy. She had this weird energy about her, like a kid on Christmas morning, except instead of presents under the tree, she was apparently planning to collect something else entirely. "Morning, babe," I mumbled, stumbling toward the bathroom to start my usual routine. Check blood sugar, calculate breakfast insulin, try not to die before noon. You know, the standard diabetic morning checklist. Except when I reached for my glucose meter on the nightstand, it wasn't there. "Hey, Clara," I called out. "Have you seen my meter?" "Check the bathroom counter," she called back, and I could hear this weird sing-song quality in her voice that should have been my first red flag. But hey, I was barely conscious and hadn't had my coffee yet, so my detective skills were operating at about the level of a sleepy golden retriever. The meter wasn't in the bathroom either, or the kitchen, or any of the usual places I keep my medical supplies because, fun fact, when you have a chronic illness, you tend to be pretty organized about life or death equipment. That's when I started to notice other things were missing. My insulin pump, which I'd taken off the night before to shower, wasn't on the dresser where I'd left it. The emergency insulin pens I keep in the medicine cabinet? Gone. The backup meter I stash in my car? Also missing. Clara, I said, and now I was fully awake and starting to feel that little flutter of panic that every diabetic knows intimately. That, oh shit, where's my stuff? Feeling that hits when you realize you might be in actual trouble. Where's all my diabetes equipment? She appeared in the kitchen doorway with this smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, holding a cup of coffee like she was posing for a magazine ad about domestic bliss. What equipment? Don't play dumb with me. My pump, my insulin, my meters, all of it. Where is it? I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, taking a slow sip of her coffee like she had all the time in the world. Meanwhile, I'm standing there in my pajamas, mentally calculating how long I can go without insulin before things get genuinely dangerous. Spoiler alert, not very long. That's when I started tearing the house apart like some kind of medical supply scavenger hunt. I checked every drawer, every cabinet, every possible hiding spot where a normal person might put important medication. Behind the cereal boxes, under the bathroom sink, in the laundry room, even in the garage where we keep the Christmas decorations because Clara has a weird thing about seasonal organization. Nothing. Nada. Zilch. But then I remembered my secret stash. The emergency insulin pen I keep hidden behind the frozen peas in the freezer, because if there's one place Clara never looks, it's anywhere that requires actual meal planning. I rushed to the kitchen, pushed aside the frozen vegetables, and gone. Even my backup plan had vanished into thin air. That's when I found Clara standing in the kitchen doorway, no longer pretending to drink coffee, just watching me with this expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't angry or sad or even crazy. It was calculating, like she was running some kind of experiment and I was the lab rat. Looking for something? She asked, and there was definitely something different about her voice now. Less sing-song, more predatory. Clara, this isn't funny anymore. I need my insulin. Like, actually need it. As in, I could die without it. I know exactly what you need, she said, and then she did something that made my blood run cold. She opened her hand, and there were 3 insulin vials nestled in her palm like little glass eggs. My insulin, my life-saving, carefully prescribed, literally keeping me alive medication. Give me those, I said, reaching for them, but she snapped her hand closed and stepped back. I don't think so. And that's when I realized this wasn't about attention anymore, or jealousy, or whatever psychological drama I'd been telling myself was behind Clara's weird behavior. This was something else entirely. This was control. This was power. This was my wife holding my life in her hands like it was some kind of poker chip she could cash in whenever she felt like it. If I can't have diabetes, she said, moving toward the kitchen sink, then neither can you. She held the vials over the disposal like she was dangling a carrot in front of a horse, except instead of a carrot, it was my medication, and instead of a horse, it was her husband who was probably going to die without it. Clara, think about what you're doing, I said, trying to keep my voice calm even though internally I was screaming. This is insane. This is actually, legitimately insane. Is it? She asked, tilting her head like she was genuinely curious about my opinion. Because it seems pretty reasonable to me. You get all this attention, all this sympathy, all these special accommodations because of your little condition. What do I get? Nothing. I'm just the wife. The caregiver. The person who has to deal with your constant blood sugar checks and your special meals and your medical emergencies. My medical emergencies? I couldn't help myself. Clara, you literally faked a seizure at my birthday party. That was different, she said, and I could see her grip tightening on those vials. That was me trying to understand what it's like. But you won't let me in. You won't share. So maybe it's time we both knew what it felt like to be normal. Normal. Like diabetes was some kind of exclusive club she'd been unfairly rejected from, instead of an autoimmune condition that makes every single day a balancing act between too much sugar and not enough insulin. Listen, I've heard of couples fighting over stupid stuff. Toothpaste caps, dirty dishes, whose turn it is to take out the trash. But life-saving medication? That's a whole new level of marital dysfunction that I'm pretty sure they don't cover in any of those relationship self-help books. So there I was, standing in my kitchen in my freaking pajamas, watching my wife dangle my insulin over the garbage disposal like she was some kind of suburban terrorist with a medical degree from Google University. And let me tell you, when your life literally depends on those little glass vials, watching someone treat them like bargaining chips is about as fun as a root canal performed by a drunk monkey. Clara had this look on her face that I'd never seen before, part satisfied, part curious, like she was conducting some twisted science experiment and I was the unfortunate lab rat. She wasn't angry or emotional. She was calm, calculating, which, honestly, was way more terrifying than if she'd been screaming and throwing things like a normal person having a mental breakdown. "So here's how this is going to work," she said, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, like she was explaining the rules of a board game instead of holding my life hostage. "You're going to do exactly what I say when I say it, or these little vials are going down the drain faster than your blood sugar's about to crash." "Clara, what do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level even though my hands were already starting to shake a little. Not from fear. Well, okay, maybe partially from fear, but because my glucose levels were starting to climb without any insulin to keep them in check. "Money? You want money? Because we can talk about our finances like normal married people instead of whatever this psychotic episode is supposed to be." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual laugh. It was this cold, bitter sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Money? You think this is about money? God, you really don't get it, do you?" "Then enlighten me," I said, because honestly, I was completely lost. "What is this about? What could you possibly want that's worth risking your husband's life?" "I want you to admit it," she said, and there was this gleam in her eyes that reminded me of those true crime documentaries where they interview serial killers who think they're the smartest person in the room. "I want you to admit that you helped me fake having diabetes." I stared at her for a solid 10 seconds, trying to process what she'd just said. "I want you to run that by me again, because I think I misheard you." "You heard me perfectly," Clara said, shifting the vials from one hand to the other like she was juggling precious gems. "I want you to admit that you coached me, that you taught me how to fake hypoglycemia, that the whole thing was your idea." "My idea?" I couldn't help but laugh, even though nothing about this situation was remotely funny. "Clara, are you completely insane? Why the hell would I teach someone how to fake a medical condition that could literally kill me if people don't take it seriously?" "Because you wanted the attention," she said, like she'd figured out some great conspiracy. "You wanted people to think you were this amazing, supportive husband who was helping his wife through her own medical struggles. Saint Mark, the diabetic hero who shares his burden with his loving wife." I felt my mouth drop open. This woman, this person I'd married, promised to love and cherish, shared a mortgage with, had apparently been living in some alternate reality where I was masterminding an elaborate medical fraud scheme for, what? Social media likes? Sympathy casseroles from the neighbors? "That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," I said. "And trust me, after months of watching you perform fake seizures and steal juice boxes, that's saying something." "Is it ridiculous?" Clara asked, tilting her head like she was genuinely puzzled by my reaction. "Because it makes perfect sense to me. You get to be the hero, I get to be part of your special little club, and everyone wins." That's when I started to realize that my blood sugar was climbing fast enough to make me feel like I'd been hit by a truck. My vision was getting a little blurry, my mouth felt like I'd been chewing on cotton balls, and I was starting to get that sick, dizzy feeling that every diabetic recognizes as, "You need insulin right freaking now." "Clara," I said, and I could hear my voice getting a little slurred. "I'm starting to feel really bad. Like, dangerously bad. Whatever point you're trying to make, can we make it after you give me my insulin?" She looked at me with this clinical interest, like she was observing symptoms for her doctoral thesis in husband torture. "What's that, 400? She asked, referring to my blood sugar levels. "How long until your organs start shutting down?" "Jesus Christ," I muttered, because now I was genuinely scared. Not just worried or annoyed or frustrated, but actually, legitimately terrified. My wife was standing there discussing my potential organ failure, like she was commenting on the weather. "Answer the question," she said. "How long do you have?" I tried to think through the fog that was starting to cloud my brain. High blood sugar, what doctors politely call hyperglycemia, and what I call feeling like death warmed over, can be just as dangerous as low blood sugar, just in different ways. "I don't know," I admitted. "Hours, maybe. Days if I'm lucky." "Clara, this isn't a game." "Everything's a game," she said. The question is whether you're smart enough to play by the rules. And what are your rules exactly? Simple, Clara said, pulling out her phone with her free hand while still holding my insulin hostage with the other. You're going to tell me exactly how you coached me to fake hypoglycemia. Step by step, detail by detail. And I'm going to record every word. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if I wasn't literally dying. Here I was, sweating and shaking and probably looking like an extra from a zombie movie, while my wife demanded that I confess to a crime that existed only in her increasingly twisted imagination. Great, honey, I managed to say, because if I was going down, I was going down with my sense of humor intact. First you ruined my blood sugar, now you're ruining math too. Because last time I checked, teaching someone to fake a disease they don't have isn't exactly a marketable skill. But Clara wasn't amused by my sarcasm. She was focused, determined, like she was on a mission from God instead of having a complete psychological breakdown in our kitchen. Start talking, she said, holding up the phone to record. And make it believable. That's when I heard it, the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely screwed. The sound of footsteps on our front porch, followed by the doorbell. Our neighbor Mrs. Buford, probably coming by with another casserole or to borrow some sugar. Bless her nosy, wonderful heart. You know that moment in horror movies where the victim realizes the call is coming from inside the house? Yeah, well, I was living that moment, except instead of a creepy phone call, it was my wife with an iPhone and a serious case of main character syndrome, demanding I star in her homemade confession video while my pancreas threw a tantrum that could literally kill me. Action, Clara said, like she was Steven Spielberg directing the world's most twisted home movie. She had her phone held up in that amateur filmmaker way, you know, where the camera is shaking slightly because she's trying to hold it steady while also maintaining her grip on my insulin. Multitasking psychosis. There's a skill they don't teach you in marriage counseling. The doorbell had rung exactly once, but Clara had completely ignored it. Mrs. Buford could have been standing out there with a SWAT team and a mariachi band, and my wife wouldn't have budged from her position as director, producer, and star of Confessions of a Diabetic Husband, the Clara Chronicles. Okay, so start from the beginning, she said, zooming in on my face with the dedication of a documentary filmmaker. Tell everyone how you taught me to fake hypoglycemia. I stood there, swaying slightly because my blood sugar was now high enough to make me feel like I was underwater, and tried to wrap my head around the fact that my wife wanted me to create evidence of a crime that never happened. It was like being asked to confess to stealing the moon. Completely insane, but apparently very important to the person holding your life in their hands. Clara, this is ridiculous, I said, and my voice sounded weird even to me, kind of thick and slurred like I'd been drinking heavily instead of just slowly dying from lack of proper medical care. I never taught you anything. You came up with that whole routine on your own. Cut, she shouted, actually using movie terminology like we were on a real film set instead of standing in our kitchen while I experienced what medical professionals would probably call a life-threatening emergency. That's not what we practiced. We didn't practice anything, I protested, but she was already shaking her head like I was a disappointing actor who couldn't remember his lines. Do it again, she commanded. And this time, sound believable. Put some emotion into it. Make people understand how guilty you feel about what you've done. What I'd done. Right. What I'd apparently done was marry a woman who'd watched one too many true crime podcasts and decided she wanted to be both the victim and the detective in her own made-up mystery. The only problem was that her story made about as much sense as a screen door on a submarine, and I was the poor bastard she'd cast as the villain. I can barely stand up, I told her, which was becoming increasingly true. The room was starting to do this fun thing where it swayed back and forth like I was on a boat, and my hands were shaking so badly, I probably looked like I was auditioning for a part in a zombie movie. How about we film this after you give me my insulin, and I'm not, you know, actively dying? The drama is perfect, Clara said, and I swear she had this gleam in her eyes like a director who'd just discovered the perfect shot. You look exactly like someone who's been caught in a terrible lie. Sweaty, nervous, guilty. It's perfect, perfect. My wife thought my medical emergency was perfect for her little film project. If I wasn't currently focused on not going into diabetic ketoacidosis, I might have appreciated the irony of the situation. Here I was, starring in a medical drama where I was playing myself, except the script was written by someone who clearly didn't understand the basic premise of the show. Okay, take two, she announced, holding up the phone again. And this time, try to look directly into the camera when you confess. Eye contact is very important for establishing credibility. Credibility. She wanted me to establish credibility while confessing to something that never happened, recorded on an iPhone by someone who was currently committing what I was pretty sure qualified as attempted murder. The whole situation was so absurd it felt like a sketch from Saturday Night Live, except nobody was going to yell live from New York, and everything would go back to normal after the commercial break. I tried to focus on the camera, but my vision was getting blurry and I kept losing track of where I was supposed to be looking. Clara, I said, and even I could hear how pathetic I sounded. I can't do this right now. I'm really sick. You're not sick, she snapped, getting frustrated with my lack of cooperation. You're just being dramatic. Now say the words. I taught my wife Clara how to fake hypoglycemic episodes because I wanted attention. I'm not going to say that because it's not true. Say it. No. She lowered the phone for a moment, looking at me with this expression of pure annoyance, like I was being unreasonable for refusing to create false evidence of a crime I didn't commit while experiencing a genuine medical emergency. You know what? Fine. We'll do this the hard way. That's when she did something that made my already racing heart skip a beat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a pen, not an insulin pen, just a regular ballpoint pen, and a piece of paper. Write it down then, she said, shoving both items toward me. If you won't say it, write it. I, Mark Thompson, confessed to teaching my wife how to fake diabetes symptoms. I stared at the pen in her outstretched hand, and for a moment, I actually considered it. Not because I wanted to confess to something I didn't do, but because my hands were shaking so violently that I wasn't sure I could hold a pen steady enough to write anything comprehensible. I'd probably end up with something that looked like a ransom note written during an earthquake. Go on, Clara encouraged, waving the pen at me like she was conducting an orchestra of one very sick musician. Write your confession. That's when we both heard it. A sharp knock on the front door, followed by a voice that sounded like it meant business. Hello? Clara? Mark? I know you're in there. I can see your cars in the driveway. Mrs. Buford. God bless that nosy old woman and her impeccable timing. Let me tell you something about Mrs. Buford. That woman has a sixth sense for trouble that would make a detective jealous. She's like a human smoke detector, except instead of sensing fire, she senses bullshit from 3 houses away. And thank God for that, because right about now, I needed all the help I could get from the neighborhood watch committee of 1. Clara. Mark, she called again, and this time her voice had that no-nonsense tone that meant she wasn't going anywhere until she got some answers. Mrs. Buford didn't mess around when she thought something was wrong, which is probably why she'd survived 83 years in a world full of people who mind their own business. I brought you some leftover apple pie from last night's church social. Apple pie? Of course it was apple pie. Here I am, literally dying from high blood sugar, and salvation comes in the form of baked goods that could probably send me into a diabetic coma just from looking at them. But hey, I wasn't complaining about the delivery method. Mrs. Buford could have shown up with deep-fried Twinkies, and I would have been grateful. Clara froze like a deer in headlights, still holding my insulin vials in one hand and her phone in the other. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, she looked uncertain, like she hadn't planned for the possibility that the outside world might intrude on her little home movie production. Don't answer it, she whispered, which was probably the stupidest thing she could have said, because Mrs. Buford wasn't the type of person who gave up just because you pretended not to be home. That woman had persistence that would make a telemarketer weep with envy. I can see movement through your kitchen window, Mrs. Buford called out, and I could hear her getting closer to the door. And your cars are both here. I'm not leaving until I know you're okay. God bless nosy neighbors with excellent eyesight and nothing better to do on a Friday morning than deliver pie and conduct wellness checks on the entire block. Mrs. Buford was like the unofficial mayor of our street, keeping tabs on everyone's business and making sure nobody died of loneliness or stupidity on her watch. Clara was starting to panic now, and I could see her trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected plot twist in her carefully orchestrated psychological thriller. She couldn't exactly answer the door while holding her husband's life-saving medication hostage, but she also couldn't ignore Mrs. Buford indefinitely without raising even more suspicion. Just tell her you're sick, Clara hissed at me. Tell her you have the flu or something, and you can't come to the door. I am sick, I pointed out, swaying slightly as another wave of nausea hit me. I'm sick because my lunatic wife is holding my insulin hostage while playing director in her own twisted home movie. That's not the kind of sick I meant. Mrs. Buford knocked again, louder this time, and I could hear her trying the doorknob. Thank God Clara had locked it earlier, because knowing Mrs. Buford, she probably would have just walked right in and caught us in the middle of this whole surreal scene. Mark, Mrs. Buford's voice was closer now, like she was pressed right up against the door. Are you in there, honey? You don't sound so good. And that's when I realized something that made my heart leap with hope. Mrs. Buford knew. Somehow, that amazing old woman with her pie and her nosiness and her inability to mind her own business knew that something was seriously wrong. Maybe it was the way Clara had answered, or maybe it was just her supernatural ability to detect neighborhood drama, but she wasn't buying whatever story we were trying to sell. I'm fine, Mrs. Buford, I called out, trying to make my voice sound normal even though I felt like I was talking through a mouthful of cotton. Just not feeling great this morning. She said, and I could practically hear her BS detector going off like a car alarm. Have you checked your blood sugar today, dear? Bingo. That wonderful, observant, pie-bearing angel of a woman had cut right to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Buford might be old, but she wasn't stupid. She'd been watching me manage my diabetes for years, and she knew exactly what it looked like when something was wrong. Clara's face went white as she realized that Mrs. Buford wasn't just making casual conversation. She was conducting an interrogation through our front door. And Mrs. Buford was good at it, probably because she'd had decades of practice getting information out of people who didn't want to share. Of course he has, Clara called out, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. Everything's fine. We're just having a lazy morning. That's funny, Mrs. Buford said, and there was something in her tone that made it clear she wasn't buying a word of Clara's performance. Because Mark usually checks his sugar first thing when he wakes up. Don't you, Mark? The woman was a genius. She was giving me an opening to let her know that something was seriously wrong without directly confronting Clara or escalating the situation. All I had to do was find a way to signal that I needed help without making Clara panic and do something even more dangerous than she'd already done. I looked at Clara, who was staring at me with this warning expression that clearly said, "Don't you dare." And then I made a decision that probably saved my life. I nodded toward my empty pocket, the gesture weak but visible through the crack in the door that Mrs. Buford was probably peering through like a detective examining evidence. Mark, Mrs. Buford's voice was sharper now, more focused. Did you hear me, honey? Have you checked your levels this morning? I managed another weak nod, this time toward the kitchen where Clara was still holding my supplies hostage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Mrs. Buford caught it immediately, because that woman didn't miss anything when it came to the health and safety of her unofficial neighborhood constituency. Clara, Mrs. Buford said, and now her voice had completely changed from friendly neighbor to concerned authority figure. I think you better let me in. Something doesn't seem right here. Everything's fine, Clara insisted, but her voice was getting higher and more strained. Really, we just need some privacy. Honey, Mrs. Buford said, and there was steel in her voice now. I've been living on this street for 40 years, and I know when something's not fine. Now either you open this door, or I'm calling 911. Your choice. You know how they say desperate times call for desperate measures? Well, apparently Clara took that saying and ran with it straight into the deep end of the crazy pool, because the minute Mrs. Buford threatened to call 911, my wife went from wannabe filmmaker to full-blown domestic terrorist faster than you could say diabetic ketoacidosis. Fine, Clara said, her voice dropping to this dangerous whisper that made my already churning stomach do a few extra somersaults. If that's how you want to play it. Before I could even process what she meant, she grabbed my arm and dragged me back toward the kitchen with the kind of determination usually reserved for people fleeing natural disasters. Except in this case, the disaster was my wife's complete psychological breakdown, and I was being dragged toward it instead of away from it. Clara, what are you doing? I asked, stumbling after her because my coordination was shot to hell and my legs felt like they were made of overcooked spaghetti. Mrs. Buford's going to call the cops if we don't. Let her call, Clara snapped, pushing me against the kitchen counter with surprising strength for someone who'd never shown any interest in physical fitness beyond complaining about her gym membership fees. We're going to finish this conversation one way or another. That's when she did something that made my blood pressure spike even higher than my glucose levels. She started opening my insulin vials and dumping them down the garbage disposal like she was getting rid of evidence at a crime scene. Not carefully, not methodically, but with this frantic energy that reminded me of someone trying to flush drugs before a police raid. "This one's for when your mother called to check on you first instead of asking about me," she said, unscrewing the cap on the first vial and watching the clear liquid disappear down the drain. The sound of my life-saving medication hitting the metal blades of the disposal was probably the most horrifying thing I'd ever heard, like listening to someone destroy a priceless piece of art with a sledgehammer. "This one's for when you got flowers at the hospital and I didn't," she continued, opening the second vial. More insulin down the drain, more of my ability to stay alive washing away while my wife provided color commentary like some deranged sports announcer calling the world's most twisted game. "And this one," she said, holding up the third vial like it was a trophy she'd won for being the most psychologically damaged spouse in suburban America. "This one's for every single time someone asked about your health without bothering to ask about mine." I watched in absolute horror as she poured out the contents of that vial too, and I swear I could feel each drop hit the disposal like a nail in my coffin. That was it. All of my emergency insulin, all of my backup supplies, everything that stood between me and a trip to the morgue, going down the drain because my wife had decided that my medical condition was somehow a personal insult to her. "Clara, you're literally killing me," I said, and I wasn't being dramatic. I was stating a medical fact. "Without that insulin, I'm going to die." Like, actually die? Dead. Not coming back. "Is that what you want?" "What I want," she said, turning to face me with the empty vial still in her hands like some kind of twisted victory trophies, "is for people to understand that I'm suffering too. Do you know what it's like being married to someone with a chronic illness? Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to always come second to a pancreas?" A pancreas. She was jealous of an organ. My wife was having a mental breakdown because she felt like she was competing with my malfunctioning internal organs for attention, and somehow the pancreas was winning. "You come second to a pancreas because the pancreas keeps me alive," I shouted, probably louder than I should have given that Mrs. Buford was still outside and could probably hear every word. "It's not a competition, Clara. It's basic human survival." But Clara wasn't listening to reason anymore. She was holding up the last vial, the final one, my absolute last shot at getting the insulin I needed, and examining it like Hamlet contemplating Yorick's skull. This was it, the grand finale of her performance, and she was going to milk it for everything it was worth. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said, rolling the vial between her palms like she was warming up dice before a big throw. "I actually thought we could do this together. I thought we could be this power couple, both dealing with diabetes, supporting each other through the struggles. But you had to be selfish about it." Selfish. I was selfish for having an autoimmune condition that I didn't choose and couldn't control. Right. That made about as much sense as accusing someone of being selfish for getting struck by lightning or winning the lottery. Except in this case, the lottery was a lifelong medical condition that required constant management just to stay alive. The sirens were getting closer now. I could hear them in the distance, that distinctive wail of emergency vehicles that meant Mrs. Buford had made good on her threat to call 911. Thank God for that woman and her complete inability to mind her own business when it actually mattered. "Hear that?" Clara asked, tilting her head toward the sound like she was enjoying some kind of musical performance. "Looks like your girlfriend called the cavalry. How romantic. Too bad they're going to be too late." She moved toward the disposal again, holding that last vial over the opening like she was conducting some kind of ritual sacrifice. The sound of the sirens was getting louder, which meant help was maybe 2 or 3 minutes away, but I wasn't sure I had 2 or 3 minutes left before Clara decided to finish what she'd started. "Please," I said, and I hated how weak and desperate I sounded, but I was way past caring about pride or dignity at this point. "Clara, please. That's the last one. If you destroy that, I'm not going to make it to the hospital." She looked at me with this expression that I still have nightmares about, part pity, part satisfaction, part genuine curiosity about what would happen if she just let me die right there in our kitchen. It was like she was weighing her options, trying to decide whether keeping me alive was worth more than making whatever twisted point she was trying to make. Maybe, she said slowly, that would solve both our problems. That's when the front door burst open and Mrs. Buford's voice cut through the kitchen like a battle cry. Step away from that boy right now, you crazy bitch. Fast forward 10 days, and I'm sitting in a courtroom that smells like disinfectant and broken dreams, hooked up to a glucose monitor that beeps every 5 minutes like some kind of medical metronome, keeping time with the rhythm of justice. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca who charges more per hour than I make in a week, but apparently knows her way around attempted murder cases, keeps glancing at me like she's worried I might keel over during the proceedings. Can't say I blame her for the concern. The last time anyone saw me, I was being wheeled out of my own kitchen on a stretcher, for bags hanging off me like Christmas ornaments, while paramedics rattled off numbers that sounded way too high to be coming from inside a human body. Turns out nearly dying from diabetic ketoacidosis really takes it out of you. Who knew? But hey, at least I'm alive to sit in this uncomfortable wooden chair and watch my wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, if my divorce lawyer has anything to say about it, try to convince a judge that she's the real victim in this whole twisted story. Claire is sitting at the defendant's table about 20 feet away from me, and she's really committed to this whole performance. We're talking full waterworks, tissues, red-rimmed eyes, the occasional dramatic sniffle that echoes through the courtroom like she's auditioning for a community theater production of Wrongfully Accused Wife, the musical. She's even dressed the part, wearing this conservative blue dress that makes her look like she volunteers at church bake sales instead of, trying to murder her husband with medical negligence. Her lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit who probably specializes in defending people who do terrible things but look really sorry about it afterward, keeps patting her shoulder in this reassuring way, like she's some kind of tragic figure instead of a woman who literally poured life-saving medication down a garbage disposal while filming it for posterity. Your Honor, he says, standing up with the kind of dramatic flair that suggests he's watched way too many legal dramas. My client is clearly struggling with the emotional burden of being married to someone with a chronic illness. This was a cry for help, not a criminal act. A cry for help. Right. Because nothing says, I need emotional support, like systematically destroying your spouse's insulin while demanding they confess to crimes they didn't commit. That's definitely the kind of cry for help that most marriage counselors recommend. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman who looks like she eats defense attorneys for breakfast and asks for seconds, isn't having any of it. She stands up with a stack of evidence that's probably thicker than most novels, and I can see Clara's confident expression starting to crack around the edges. Your Honor, the prosecutor says, this wasn't a cry for help. This was attempted murder. The defendant systematically removed all of Mr. Thompson's insulin supplies, hid them from him, and then destroyed them while he was experiencing a life-threatening medical emergency. She filmed herself doing it. She demanded he confess to fictional crimes while his blood sugar was reaching levels that could have caused organ failure. That's when they start playing the video evidence. And let me tell you, watching your own near-death experience on a big screen in front of a room full of strangers is about as surreal as you'd imagine. There's Clara, holding my insulin vials like some kind of suburban terrorist, explaining her grievances against my pancreas while I'm literally dying in the background. The sound quality is surprisingly good for an iPhone recording. You can hear everything, my slurred speech getting progressively worse, Clara's increasingly unhinged commentary about hospital flowers and mother-in-law phone calls, even the moment when Mrs. Buford started pounding on the door like the cavalry arriving just in time to save the day. Clara's watching the video too, and I swear I can see the exact moment when she realizes how absolutely insane she looks. It's one thing to live through your own psychological breakdown, but it's another thing entirely to watch it played back in high definition while a room full of legal professionals takes notes on your descent into madness. That's when the crying really starts. Not the elegant, sympathetic tears she was working with earlier, but the ugly, desperate crying of someone who's just figured out that their brilliant plan to frame their husband for coaching fake medical episodes maybe wasn't as brilliant as they thought. I didn't mean it, she sobs, and her voice cracks in that way that might be genuinely remorseful or might just be really good acting. With Clara, it's honestly hard to tell the difference anymore. I never meant for him to get that sick. I just wanted people to understand what I was going through. The judge, a stern-looking woman who probably deals with this kind of domestic insanity on a daily basis, doesn't look impressed by Clara's sudden attack of conscience. She's been taking notes throughout the entire proceeding, and something tells me those notes don't say poor misunderstood wife needs a hug and some couples therapy. Mrs. Thompson, the judge says, and her voice has that tone that means business. Are you telling this court that you didn't intend to cause harm when you deliberately withheld life-saving medication from your diabetic husband? I thought he would be okay. Clara stammers, and even I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. I didn't know it would get that bad that fast. You didn't know that a diabetic person would become seriously ill without insulin? The judge asks, and I can hear the incredulity in her voice. Mrs. Thompson, you've been married to a type 1 diabetic for over a year. You've seen him manage his condition daily. Are you seriously telling me you didn't understand the consequences of withholding his medication? Clara's lawyer jumps up like he's trying to save a sinking ship with a teacup. Your Honor, my client was clearly in an emotional state. Your client, the judge interrupts, made a deliberate choice to endanger her husband's life. She didn't accidentally hide his insulin. She didn't mistakenly destroy his medication. She systematically removed his access to life-saving treatment while filming herself doing it. Yeah, right, Clara. And I don't mean it every time I say just one slice of pizza when I'm staring at a whole pepperoni pie. Intent matters, honey, and your intent was pretty damn clear when you were naming each vial after your personal grievances while pouring them down the drain. The evidence was overwhelming. The video recordings, the destroyed insulin, the knife she'd waved around during her final performance, witness testimony from Mrs. Buford about my condition when the paramedics arrived. Clara was cooked, overdone, burnt toast with a side of attempted murder charges. So here I am, 6 months later, sitting in my own living room, in my own house, with my own insulin safely locked away in a medication safe that requires more security codes than a nuclear launch facility. Life's funny like that. You never really appreciate the simple pleasure of injecting yourself with life-saving medication without fear of your spouse stealing it until you've lived through the alternative. Clara's out on bail, thank God, but she might as well be on Mars for all the contact we're allowed to have. The restraining order the judge slapped down basically says she needs to stay 500 feet away from me and my pancreas at all times, which is honestly the best relationship advice anyone's ever given us. Turns out the secret to a happy marriage isn't communication or compromise. It's a legally enforced perimeter that prevents your spouse from committing felonies against your endocrine system. The paperwork for that restraining order is a thing of beauty, let me tell you. It's got all the legal language you'd expect, but there's this one line that makes me laugh every time I read it. Defendant is prohibited from interfering with plaintiff's medical care, including but not limited to the concealment, destruction, or manipulation of prescribed medications. Including but not limited to. Like the judge was thinking, what other creative ways might this woman try to kill her husband? Better cover all our bases here. My neighbor Mrs. Buford has basically appointed herself as my personal chef, nutritionist, and security detail all rolled into one 70-pound package of pure determination. She shows up every other day with casseroles that are perfectly portioned for my dietary needs, and I swear she's memorized my carb-counting routine better than I have. Yesterday, she brought over this amazing chicken and vegetable dish with a little index card that said 32 grams of carbs total, recommend 4 units of insulin. Enjoy. The woman missed her calling as a diabetes educator. You need to eat like a king, she tells me every time she drops off food, like I'm recovering from some kind of medieval siege instead of just trying to get my life back together after my wife tried to murder me with medical negligence. But honestly, I'm not complaining. Mrs. Buford's cooking is incredible, and it's nice to have someone around who treats my diabetes like a normal medical condition instead of a personal attack on their self-esteem. My parents finally came clean about missing the signs, which was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. Turns out they'd been worried about Clara's behavior for months, but didn't want to interfere in our marriage. Mom keeps apologizing for not saying something sooner, and Dad keeps muttering about how he knew something was off about that girl from the beginning, which is classic dad revisionist history, but I appreciate the sentiment. We should have trusted our instincts, Mom said during one of our weekly phone calls that have become a thing since I nearly died in my own kitchen. But she seemed so normal. Normal, right? Because normal people definitely film themselves destroying their spouse's medication while providing director's commentary about hospital flower arrangements. But I get what Mom means. Clara was good at the normal act when she needed to be. It's the not normal stuff that really made an impression. The divorce proceedings are moving along about as smoothly as you'd expect when one spouse tried to kill the other one, and it's all documented on video. My lawyer says it's pretty much the most straightforward divorce case she's ever handled, which is saying something considering she's been practicing family law for 20 years. Usually we have to argue about who gets the house, she told me. In your case, we just have to make sure your ex-wife doesn't try to burn it down. I've been going to therapy, which probably should have happened about a year ago, but better late than never, right? My therapist, Dr. Martinez, specializes in trauma recovery, and she's helping me work through what she calls medical trauma, and what I call the time my wife went completely insane and tried to murder me with diabetes. We're working on trust issues, which makes sense considering my wife violated literally every possible form of trust you can have in a marriage. Financial trust, emotional trust, the basic trust that your spouse won't actively try to kill you. Clara managed to destroy all of them in one spectacular weekend. It's normal to feel hyper-vigilant about your medical supplies, Dr. Martinez tells me during our sessions. Your sense of safety was fundamentally violated by someone you trusted completely. It's going to take time to rebuild that security. She's right, of course. I check my medication safe about 15 times a day, even though I'm literally the only person who knows the combination. I've got backup supplies hidden in 3 different locations, plus emergency kits in my car, my office, and my gym bag. It's probably overkill, but you know what they say about being prepared. Better to be over-prepared than dead from diabetic ketoacidosis because your spouse decided your pancreas was getting too much attention. The weird thing is, I've started joking about it more than I probably should. Dark humor, Dr. Martinez calls it, and apparently it's a pretty normal coping mechanism for people who've survived intimate partner medical abuse, which is apparently a real thing that happens often enough to have its own clinical terminology. Who knew? Hey, at least I've got great material for online dating profiles, I told her last week. Looking for someone who won't try to kill me with my own medical condition. Must love pancreases. No medical fetishists, please. She didn't think it was as funny as I did, but she's working on helping me process trauma, not appreciate my comedy genius. The truth is, I laugh because if I don't laugh, I'll cry. And I've done enough crying over the past 6 months to last me a lifetime. Crying over the marriage I thought I had. Crying over the person I thought Clara was. Crying over how close I came to dying in my own kitchen while my wife filmed it like some kind of twisted reality show. But I'm alive, and that's what matters. I'm alive, I'm free, and my insulin is locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Clara can find someone else to compete with for medical attention. Me and my pancreas are officially off the market. Lesson learned. Marriage is about sharing, sure, but not your insulin. Some things are just too important to trust to another person, even if you promise to love and cherish them till death do you part. Especially when death almost did us part, and it wasn't exactly natural causes.